Korea, Iraq, and the economy. Also, Energy Secretary Spencer Abraham will be here to discuss the crisis in Venezuela and its impact on energy prices in this country. Jobs. They have already closed 300 stores at the bankrupt retailer. We'll have a live report for you. President Bush today said the United States will consider energy aid for North Korea should Pyongyang abandon its nuclear weapons program. President Bush maintained, however, that the United States will not be blackmailed. Former Defense Secretary, Moneyline regular contributor William Cohen will be here to discuss the possibilities of a diplomatic solution to this nuclear standoff. 2 Air National Guard pilots could be tried on manslaughter charges in the friendly fire deaths of 4 Canadian soldiers in Afghanistan last year. Francis Boyle, an international law professor at the University of Illinois, will be here. He says those pilots are being made scapegoats. And on Wall Street today, the stock market closed higher. Christine Romans will have the latest for us. Those stories and much more coming right up. It is now 6 o'clock in the East.
This is Lou Dobbs Moneyline for Tuesday, January 14th. Here now, Lou Dobbs.
Good evening. The nation's number 3 retailer today announced the largest store closing since declaring bankruptcy a year ago. Kmart will shut 326 stores and cut as many as 35,000 jobs, 15% of its workforce. Kmart has been struggling to compete against discount retailers such as Walmart and Target. Mary Snow has the report. Mary?
Well, Lou, Kmart saying today that it is closing these stores in 44 states. It will also close a distribution center, saying that it is doing this to emerge from Chapter 11 bankruptcy in April of this year. Kmart, of course, filed for Chapter 11 in January of 2002. And of the states, Texas is the hardest hit. 54 stores are slated to close. We are here in Brooklyn, New York, where the Kmart behind me is also slated to close down. And, you know, this is the second big cut within a year. Back in March, Kmart shut down some 283 stores, laying off 22,000 employees at that time. And as you mentioned, Kmart has been so hard hit by fierce competition from fellow discounter Walmart, also stores like Target. The company saying today that it was shutting down these stores in unprofitable areas. Also, they needed to get out of some of the leases in order to emerge from Chapter 11. Some of the experts, though, skeptical that come April, Kmart will be positioned to survive once it has made all these cuts. Lou?
Mary, thank you very much, Mary Snow. Thousands of General Electric employees continue to walk the picket lines tonight despite an accident that claimed the life of a striker in Louisville, Kentucky. At 5 o'clock this morning, a woman was struck and killed by a police car. The police say it was an accident. She was one of 17,000 workers from 48 plants protesting increasing health care co-payments. Workers started the 48-hour strike at 1 past midnight. They plan to be back on the job Thursday morning. The general strike in Venezuela has now moved into a 6th week, and it is boiling out of control. Today, President Hugo Chavez ordered the military to seize all weapons from the Caracas police force, except for their .38 caliber revolvers. Chavez accused the police of siding with the demonstrators. The 6-week-long strike has paralyzed Venezuela's oil industry, and that in turn has caused U.S. crude oil prices to hit a 2-year high. Energy prices also higher because of the prospect of war with Iraq and a cold winter around much of the country. Joining me now to talk about the situation is the Secretary of Energy, Spencer Abraham, joining us tonight from our studios in Washington, D.C. Mr. Secretary, good to have you.
Lou, good to be back on the show.
The strike in Venezuela is creating immense problems. We take about 14% of our oil that we import from Venezuela. What is the prospect in your judgment?
Well, I don't have any inside information, Lou. I mean, obviously, it's a day-to-day kind of challenge, and I know that Chavez will be coming to the United States, the UN, and seeking international assistance in the process, but I don't have any inside information that suggests an early end to the problems.
No early end to that problem, and other problems, as you alluded to, continue, it seems, to mount in terms of Iraq and the war against terror. OPEC over the weekend agreed to raise its production. Will that be sufficient to allay any real dramatic shortage?
Well, we welcomed the news of OPEC's decision. I think the role that Saudi Arabia played in pushing for that increase is to be commended, and it's consistent with OPEC's previous statements that they would act to address supply disruptions. And I think that this will fill much of the hole created by Venezuela's strike. We'll obviously be monitoring it very closely to decide how well that goes forward. I do think that the markets responded last week when these announcements came out the right way, and we'll now be closely watching the circumstances as they proceed.
Of course, oil today moving well above $32 a barrel. Not a helpful sign, and in point of fact, there were reports that you had discussions directly with Saudi Arabia and OPEC. Were those reports true?
Well, Lou, you know, we have ongoing discussions with both the Saudi Energy Ministry and other OPEC countries. We don't talk about those discussions. We try to keep this discussion out of the media and more on a private level. But I think the final results of OPEC's decisions last Sunday were very positive ones. We'll, as I said, have to monitor the circumstance to see how it addresses the shortfall created by Venezuela.
Of course, with the prospect of war with Iraq, concerns about the levels in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, are they adequate in your judgment should there be a disruption of Middle Eastern oil?
Well, I'm not going to speculate about what might happen in terms of Iraq. I think that's in other cabinet members' portfolios. But I will say that we have acted over the last months to increase the reserve. Right now we have the largest reserve we've ever had, almost 600 million barrels of oil there, which provides us with a great, I think, and reliable source of supply in the event that it's ever needed.
And with a Strategic Petroleum Reserve at the highest levels, are those levels and overall supplies, again, in your judgment, adequate to forestall any serious, dramatic disruption in oil and energy supplies to this country?
Well, we've obviously been working to increase the reserve to be able to deal with challenges we might face. Also, as you know, Lou, the International Energy Agency, which is basically an organization of consuming countries, has other reserves around the world that are available to deal with circumstances that might develop at some point in the future. So there are a number of reserves. But as I said, we've increased and we're headed towards the goal of fully filling the reserve, which would be another 100 million barrels. And we're working hard to achieve that goal.
And Mr. Secretary, geopolitics and aside, we are looking at what are some people are estimating 41% increases in home heating oil prices for consumers over this winter, particularly in the Northeast. Natural gas prices have risen to near record levels. And just over the weekend, gasoline prices for regular gasoline going up by 5 cents a gallon, on average $1.50 around this country. Does the Bush administration have plans to help consumers deal with these rising prices?
Well, we think the most important thing that could have already been done to address our energy challenges is for Congress to pass an energy bill to try to expand domestic production so we'd have more sources of energy, so we can move forward with incentives to use more renewable energy and alternative energy sources. In the short term, obviously, we monitor the situation closely. Prices compared to last winter are higher, although that was an abnormally warm winter, and the recession drew down the amount of energy usage. But we're always concerned about the price of energy. The President cares very much about it, and that's why we hope to pass an energy bill this year to try to address the long-term challenges we face.
Spencer Abraham, Secretary of the Department of Energy, thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Lou.
Turning now to the war against terror. In Britain today, a police officer was killed. 4 other policemen were wounded during a raid on a suspected terrorist hideout. The police officers were investigating an alleged plot to use the deadly poison ricin. Tim Rogers from ITN has the report for us from Manchester, England. Tim?
Yeah, I can hear you fine, thanks.
Yes, well, this happened earlier on this evening, about just shortly after 5:30 UK time. In the building, you can see behind me in the distance there, an apartment building where police officers from the Greater Manchester Police, accompanied by immigration officials, went to arrest a man based on a tip-off from the Metropolitan Police in London, the anti-terrorist squad. When they got there, they found that there were 3 men in the apartment building behind me, and after a brief discussion, we understand a scuffle, a fight broke out when a police officer received a fatal chest wound. Now, we also understand that 3 other officers were stabbed, and 1 officer had a broken ankle. Clearly, there was a major fight and a scuffle that was going out at that time. So precisely what happened still isn't clear. That's subject of the police investigation, which is going on at present.
Yeah, the question is,
Well, we have lost the signal from Manchester. Tim Rogers of our British affiliate ITN reporting, but to recap, 1 police officer killed, 4 others wounded in the raid against a suspected terrorist hideout in Manchester. Those 3 suspects, described only as being from Northern Africa, are in custody this evening. Back in this country, a toxic chemical is seeping into the water supply in the southwest. It comes from a chemical used in rockets as well as Cold War missiles, and it is creating great concern. Casey Wyan has the report.
These bunkers in Rialto, California were built by the U.S. Army in 1942. The site has since been occupied by several companies, including B.F. Goodrich, a rocket engine manufacturer in the 50s and 60s. A toxic chemical called perchlorate was used to make rocket fuel here and at dozens of sites nationwide. And now, because of improved testing methods, it's showing up in local water supplies. Perchlorate contamination has been found in about 250 wells throughout Southern California. Most of those, including this one, have been shut down. And the timing couldn't be worse because the region already faces a serious water shortage. Restarting the wells will require multi-million-dollar treatment facilities. This one in Riverside was funded by Lockheed Martin, another former perchlorate user. Here, tainted water filters through tanks filled with millions of tiny resin pellets.
The primary intent, certainly of our agency and of the water purveyors, is that we would identify responsible parties who put the perchlorate there and make them pay the treatment costs, and that's what we're working hard to do now.
A bigger bill may come from the Colorado River, which supplies 20 million people with water and has been found to contain perchlorate from this Kerr-McGee factory outside Las Vegas. Kerr-McGee, Lockheed Martin, and Goodrich are spending tens of millions of dollars on cleanup, but others, such as Black & Decker, are resisting, saying they have little to do with the original contaminators. The Defense Department is also fighting to minimize its financial responsibility. Payment is only part of the perchlorate debate. Also at issue, the seriousness of the health threat. Gary Praglin represents 800 current and former Redlands, California residents in a lawsuit claiming perchlorate-tainted water made them sick.
There's a lot of what they call blood cancers, leukemia, lymphoma, hematopoietic cancers. We have brain cancer, we have lung cancer, we have cervical cancer, we have Hodgkin's disease, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. You name it, we have it. And then a lot of thyroid disease in Redlands, which is a result of the perchlorate.
But a recent state study found no significant differences in area cancer rates. State and federal officials haven't yet agreed on an acceptable level of perchlorate in water. Ultimately, some of the potentially billions of dollars in costs for cleanup and replacing tainted supplies will be paid by water consumers. Casey Wyan, CNN, Rialto, California.
Coming up next, Washington steps up efforts to defuse the nuclear standoff with North Korea. We'll have the latest for you. Hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops are preparing for battle in the Persian Gulf, but our troops may be fatigued long before they face combat. Hearings begin for 2 American pilots charged with killing 4 Canadians and wounding 8 others in an Afghanistan friendly fire incident. We'll have a report and be joined by law professor Francis Boyle, who says these 2 pilots are being made scapegoats by the Pentagon. On Wall Street today, the Dow Jones Industrials gained 56 points. The Nasdaq moved higher, as did the S&P 500. We'll have the full details coming right up. Stay with us.
It's almost 200,000 people in over 40 countries, working as one. It's 10 inventions every business day. And not all of them automotive. It's going from the Indy 500 to the Fortune 500. It's Delphi, where slowing down is not an option. Gotta go.
CNN Tonight, Ed Bradley and Steve Croft of 60 Minutes, from their show's future to war in Iraq, only on Larry King Live. CNN Tonight, 9 Eastern.
IBM Net Vista. Real people, not actors. Excuse me. Come on, I want to show you some computers.
This is the Net Vista.
Beautiful design. This monitor is gorgeous.
So what is this about? I have too many people looking at me. I could see that on my desk. Have you ever lost any data?
Hasn't everybody lost data at some point?
All these computers can use Rapid Restore, which is a one-touch button that lets you go back to the last time the computer saved.
I lost my computer to virus. That's not a very good thing.
What about security?
In this day and age, security is just it's a big issue.
Well, IBM offers a range of security options if you're worried about hackers online.
That would be fantastic. I just can't afford it, probably.
Actually, this Net Vista desktop starts at just $599. It has an Intel Pentium 4 processor designed to run today's apps and tomorrow's. It also has Rapid Restore PC. Buy this Intel Pentium 4 processor-powered Net Vista desktop now, and you can get a free printer.
And would you know how to buy an IBM? Probably go online. Can I have one?
This is CNN.
President Bush today said North Korea might be offered what he called a bold initiative of benefits if North Korea abandons its nuclear weapons program. Mr. Bush said those benefits could include energy and food aid, but the president again said the United States will not be blackmailed.
People say, well, we're willing to talk to North Korea. Of course we are. But what this nation won't do is be blackmailed. And what this nation will do is use this as an opportunity to bring the Chinese and the Russians and the South Koreans and the Japanese to the table to solve this problem peacefully.
On the issue of Iraq, President Bush also said he is sick and tired of Saddam Hussein's games and deception. President Bush said time is running out for the Iraqi leader and that he must disarm. White House correspondent Dana Bash has the story.
The president made his frustration clear.
Time is running out on Saddam Hussein. He must disarm. I'm sick and tired of games and deception.
Mr. Bush sent a strong signal he is running out of patience, while patience is precisely what leaders at the UN are urging.
I think the resolution is very clear.
UN Secretary General Kofi Annan reminding reporters inspectors are just now getting up to speed, and if they determine there has been a breach,
there should be serious consequences, and I don't think we are there yet, so I really don't want to talk about war, nor is the Council talking about war.
The White House is presented with a complicated diplomatic dance. On the one hand, aides say the president has no specific timetable for deciding to forcefully disarm Iraq. On the other, reminding the world the terms of UN Resolution 1441, that the burden of proof is on Iraq, not inspectors, to reveal weapons of mass destruction.
We said we expect Saddam Hussein, for the sake of peace, to disarm. That's the question. Is Saddam Hussein disarming? He's been given 11 years to disarm. And so the world came together and we have given him one last chance to disarm. So far, I haven't seen any evidence that he is disarming.
Another factor, getting the U.S. military in place and ready to attack at an optimal time. As tens of thousands of troops ship off to the Persian Gulf, the question is how long can they cool their heels waiting for inspectors to complete their work?
Lou, with a January 27th UN deadline looming, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice went to New York today to meet with Chief UN Weapons Inspector Hans Blix. We're told that she urged him to get his team to take Iraqi scientists out of that country by the end of the month in the hopes of finding that elusive smoking gun. Lou?
Dana, thank you very much. Dana Bash reporting from the White House. U.S. spy planes will soon be flying reconnaissance missions over Iraq for the United Nations. The U-2 aircraft will be painted with UN markings. National Security Correspondent David Enzer has the story. David?
Well, that's right, Lou. The U-2 spy plane, everyone remembers when Gary Powers was shot down during the Cold War, but these planes will be painted blue, pale blue and white, unlike the ones we see in these pictures here. and they will be doing the mission of the United Nations. They will be looking for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but they'll be flown by U.S. Air Force pilots. The planes were first built to spy on the Soviet Union. They'll be under the orders now of Hans Blix and Mohammed al-Baradei, the two chief UN weapons inspectors. On board, of course, are high surveillance cameras and other spy equipment. This is not your father's U-2. These planes were built in the 1980s. The frames that are now in the air, they're a little bit heavier. They have not only the capability of taking pictures, but also there's infrared capability for night use. There's the ability to take in signals intelligence. If the Iraqi military or weapons officials are talking to each other, this plane can listen. And it flies very high. It can hover for a long time, about 9 hours in the air. So it'll be a very useful tool for the inspectors. Lou?
David, useful to the inspectors. This aircraft is one of the few that I can imagine still in service after 50 years after it was developed. Why the U-2 rather than using satellite remote sensing for this work?
What's so handy about the U-2, Lou, is that it can hover, that it can stay in the air for 9 hours at a time on a particular target. It doesn't have the rotation of the Earth to worry about, and it can go down obviously lower than satellites and focus in on a specific area. It can also go back frequently, but it flies high enough that it's not that easy for the Iraqis to know where it is exactly and when it's going to turn up. So it's just a very useful tool for looking for changes, subtle changes perhaps, in a building or a piece of construction or some material being moved out at night out of a building, which is going to be inspected the next day, that sort of thing. It's going to be a very useful tool for the United Nations. It was used, in fact, by the UNSCOM inspectors prior to '98 when they left.
David Enzer, thank you very much. David Enzer, National Security Correspondent from Washington. More than 100,000 troops have now been deployed to the Persian Gulf region. Those troops will train and wait for further orders, but the waiting and the high state of readiness required could well take a toll. Senior Pentagon correspondent Jamie McIntyre reports.
In Savannah, Georgia Tuesday, an Army transport ship was loaded with more than 1,400 tanks and other vehicles for the Army's 3rd Infantry Division, just another part of the massive deployment that could put more than 150,000 troops in the Gulf region by February. But with Turkey so far refusing to host U.S. ground forces, with U.S. allies pressing for a second UN resolution, and with UN inspectors still on the ground, the U.S. military runs the risk of being all dressed up with nowhere to go, at least not anytime soon.
How long can you let 200,000 U.S. troops sit in the sand?
The question is, how long will it take for Saddam Hussein to come clean and to prove to the world that he's disarmed?
If the U.S. deploys its troops too early, it pays a price. It costs hundreds of millions of dollars, exacts a toll on families and businesses, and makes vital training more difficult.
You have to think about how to maintain those shooting skills, those communicating skills, those moving skills, survival skills while you're deployed. And shrewd, prudent commanders have planned for that, and they're doing it right now.
But the upside to the longer deployment window is it gives the U.S. more time to move all the logistics it needs ahead of time instead of after the war begins. Pentagon sources insist the U.S. has not passed the point of no return, but they also say President Bush would not have approved all the recent U.S. troop deployments if he didn't believe it was likely he was going to have to use them. And Lou, officials here say they'll be looking for President Bush's statements in his State of the Union address on the 28th for a clue to what his actual timetable might be. Of course, that speech coming a day after the deadline for the UN weapons inspection report in New York. Lou?
Jamie, in the Persian Gulf War, as you well recall, the troops there for 6 months in the sand awaiting action. Are we approaching a significant point of potential fatigue for these troops that have already been billeted there?
Well, they're not. I don't think we've reached the point of fatigue yet. I mean, one of the upsides is that the Pentagon had warned all along that they weren't going to have time for a big buildup this time, but it looks like they will have time. That means much more logistics can come in. Now, If it reaches a point where they've been there for a couple of months and they're not able to do their regular training, then there's a lot of cost. There's stress involved, there's separation from the family, particularly if you have to bring them back and then perhaps send them back over. So you have to think if the United States is sending all those troops over, they have a pretty good idea that President Bush may have to use them one way or another.
Jamie, thank you. Jamie McIntyre, senior Pentagon correspondent. This buildup is a reminder of the huge deployments that preceded the Persian Gulf War 11 years ago. The anniversary of Desert Storm is, in fact, this Thursday evening. Former Defense Secretary, Moneyline regular contributor William Cohen joins us tonight. Bill, good to have you here. Let's turn first to the issue of North Korea. The president today talking about a bold initiative of benefits for North Korea if North Korea shuts down its nuclear weapons program. Is that blackmail succeeding?
Well, no, it's not blackmail succeeding, but basically a deal has to be made without appearing to make a deal. But I think in this particular case, what the president's insisting upon is that North Korea indicate up front that it's prepared to give up its nuclear ambitions and bring China, Japan, South Korea, and others into this particular, quote, discussion, which will lead to a negotiation. And then after that concession is made, the United States then helping to integrate North Korea into the larger community.
Is this effectively saying release the hostage first, then we'll pay you, rather than we'll pay you, then you release the hostage?
In lawyers' talk, it's a question about whether it's condition precedent or condition subsequent. What the president is saying, make it a condition precedent. You agree up front, and then we'll talk about it. The North Koreans are saying, let's talk about it, and then we'll make a deal. I think what you'll see ultimately after all of the discussion is a concurrent exchange of concessions here, namely that the North Koreans will have to give up that nuclear ambition and agree to very intrusive inspections. This will be a case where we verify but not trust, and the verification will have to be very, very intrusive.
When you cut through all of this, Bill, the negotiations, the discussion, both in the media and on the part of the diplomats, the question arises, why is this the problem of the United States? South Korea's newly elected president says he wants to move toward a higher level of cooperation with North Korea. China is the dominant power in the region, along with, to the south, Japan. Why is this not their problem rather than ours?
It's part of their problem. The Chinese do not want to see North Korea go nuclear, so to speak. They certainly don't want to see Japan possibly consider that to go nuclear as well in terms of building up its arsenal. Neither does South Korea nor Russia. So all of them have an interest in there. We also have a very serious interest in not seeing the so-called nuclear club expanded beyond where it is today. And so all of us have an interest. The United States, by virtue of our superpower status, by our deployments in the region, we certainly have a very major interest, but it's a shared responsibility, and that's what I think the president is trying to stress. Everybody has to get involved, including the United States.
Bill, let's turn to the issue of Iraq. Jamie McIntyre, our senior Pentagon correspondent, reporting on the issues of fatigue and readiness for the troops that have already been deployed to the Persian Gulf, more to follow presumably, and most people expecting precisely that. What's your judgment about the extension of our materiel and our manpower, if you will, in the Gulf?
Well, patience is said to be a virtue, but that it need not be eternal. I think there's a question of timing here in terms of how long can it go on. Right now, the burden is upon the commanders, General Franks and others, to calibrate the rate that they are assembling the forces and training them, because they have to train each and every day. So they will have some calibration there, but I think we certainly, by marshaling the forces through January, into February, perhaps even into March, we can certainly maintain a state of readiness at a very high level. Once you get beyond that, then it becomes more problematical.
Bill Cohen, thank you. On Capitol Hill today, senators strongly criticized possible changes in media ownership rules. The Federal Communications Commission is studying proposals that would allow media companies to own both newspapers and radio stations or a television station in the same markets. But critics say looser regulations could put a handful of giant companies in control of what people hear, watch, and read. This has already happened, in point of fact, in some markets under FCC waivers. And that is the subject of tonight's Moneyline poll question, which is, should we be concerned that a small number of companies already own or control almost all national network television, radio, newspaper, and web properties? Cast your vote at CNN.com/Moneyline. We'll have the results coming up later in the broadcast. Coming up next, Senator Richard Shelby will join us to tell us how he intends to restore investor confidence in corporate America. And 2 American pilots could be tried on manslaughter charges in a friendly fire incident that left 4 Canadian soldiers dead in Afghanistan. We'll be joined by law professor Francis Boyle, who says those pilots are being made into scapegoats. We'll tell you how much money it's costing the United States to decommission the rest of the world's nuclear arsenals. We'll have those stories and a great deal more still ahead. Please stay with us.
Hey, say I'm a company, any size. Big, small, pequito, grande. And you are IP Telephony. This is how some communications companies want me to get to you. Let's
Economy in waves of corporate scandals that began with Enron. The Dow is now 24% below that all-time high. Senator Richard Shelby is the new chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, and he will play a large role in restoring investor and consumer confidence, in point of fact, and setting policy for the years ahead. Richard Shelby joins us now from Washington. Senator, good to have you here.
Thank you, Lou. I'm glad to be with you.
Let's start with the president's stimulus package, the growth package that he's presented. Are you a 100% full, unequivocal supporter of that package?
Absolutely. I think overall it's a good package. I'm hoping it will stay intact. We never know legislatively what will happen, but one of the centerpieces of it is doing away with the double taxation of dividends. It's something a lot of us have advocated for years. Lou, I just believe it's wrong to double tax anything.
Well, there are, as you well know, a number of instances beyond dividends in which we see double taxation.
But that was one that stood out in this instance.
Absolutely. And as you look at the Democratic plan that has been proposed, at least in broad terms, do you see anything there that attracts you, that you find compelling, that you could meld with the president's proposals?
Well, as we get into the debate, I'm sure we'll have to consider the Democratic plan too. But as we speak, and I'm hoping that the other 50 Republicans will stay put and stay with the basic president's plan. I think it's a good one. And if we start going in every direction, then we split up and we weaken the proposal that we have before us now.
And the Democrats say that the president's package does not do enough in terms of immediate stimulus, putting money in the hands of those who would spend it first and drive this economy. How do you respond to that?
Well, if you look at the plan, the acceleration of the tax cuts, which will affect a lot of middle-class people, the tax credit for children immediately, this means a lot. It also has some long-range implications for the economy, for investors. And I think you have to put it together in a package, and I believe that's what the White House has thought out.
And the initiatives that you want to bring to your new committee, the Senate Banking Committee that you chair now, what are your priorities?
Well, my priority is first to do no harm in the market, Lou, but to also make sure others do no harm, because we've had too much cheating and fraud in accounting and investment in the investment banking area, and the investor is frankly scared right now, scared of what might be going on. We've got to do everything we can to return confidence to the investor, which is all of us. Over 100 million people, directly and indirectly, are invested in the bond market or the stock market.
We have, as you know, Senator, a poll upon poll that shows that investor confidence at either at all-time lows or near them. We have investigations that continue by the Justice Department, the SEC. We also have institutions that are here as supermarkets of the financial industry, providing every range of service. There have been those who have suggested that it's time to bring back Glass-Steagall, to divide up some of these supermarkets. Do you think that has any merit whatsoever?
I wouldn't say it wouldn't have any merit whatsoever. That's because you never know. But I think we should give Graham Bliley and Leach Bliley an opportunity to work. It was passed in late '99. Just because we've had some scandals doesn't mean everything won't work in it. But I'll tell you, we're going to pursue vigorous oversight on the banking committee. I think that's our obligation to the American people, and that's the American investor.
And are you, Senator, as we conclude here, are you satisfied with the pace of investigation and prosecution by the SEC and the Justice Department in the corporate scandals?
Well, I believe the Justice Department could do more. The state Attorney General in New York, Elliot Spitzer, took the lead role there. We will have some hearings later on the banking committee as to what kind of settlement those were, what was involved, are they adequate, and what should we do?
Senator Richard Shelby, Chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, we thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Lou.
President Bush has authorized more aid to Russia to help decommission its nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. The president's order releases $500 million that had been frozen by Congress. Kitty Pilgrim has the story for us.
The threat of nukes seems all around. North Korea talking tough about its decision to withdraw from the global nuclear non-proliferation treaty. The possibility Iraq is seeking to acquire nuclear materials. Concerns over Iran. Even U.S. ally Russia bristling with old nuclear weapons from the Cold War. With Russia, the United States is actually paying the bill to destroy nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons.
One of the things we have to realize that over the last 10 years, there's been at least $7 billion spent by the United States. And there's a pledge now of $10 billion over the next 10 years by the United States and another $10 billion coming from U.S. allies.
In the case of North Korea, in a 1994 agreement, it promised to abandon its nuclear program in return for U.S. and international aid and help with its energy programs. Some see the current tough talk as an attempt to gain even more. Non-proliferation experts like Henry Sokolsky are highly skeptical about the ability to buy compliance from North Korea or Russia.
In the case of North Korea, we thought that by building 2 reactors, which themselves, once they came online, would actually make a lot of bomb material, we could bribe or get them to stop building weapons themselves. That program has already eaten about $1.5 billion worth of money in South Korea and the U.S., and we are now discovering wasn't such a good idea. Before we make other mistakes with regard to Russia and spend a lot more money, we ought to take a good, cold look at what we're beginning to do.
Experts say the emphasis should be on accountability. The Russia program was suspended because of concerns in Congress that Russia was not properly documenting its program, and accountability should be a very large entry in any funding equation. Lou.
Kitty, thank you very much. Well, you still have time to vote in our Moneyline poll tonight. Our question, should we be concerned that a small number of companies now own or control almost all national network television, radio, newspaper, and web properties in this country? Concentration of media. You can vote at cnn.com/Moneyline. We'll have the preliminary results on this important question later in the broadcast. Still ahead, hearings began today to determine the fate of 2 U.S. pilots who've been charged in a friendly fire incident in Afghanistan. We will bring you the latest and be joined by law professor Francis Boyle, who says these pilots are being made scapegoats. Each year, advertisers unveil their newest, hottest ads at the Super Bowl. But the NFL has banned ads promoting a certain subject that some people do associate with pro football. We'll tell you what that subject is. Stay with us.
My family is important to me, and I used to worry about where my kids were on the internet.
The Air Force today began a hearing to determine whether 2 pilots should be court-martialed for a friendly fire incident. They dropped a bomb that killed 4 Canadian soldiers and wounded 8 others in Afghanistan. Ed Lavandera reports from Barksdale Air Force Base, Louisiana.
These Canadian soldiers survived the friendly fire bombing. Now they're reliving that dark April night in Afghanistan when 4 comrades were killed by an American bomb. They're the first witnesses to testify in an Article 32 hearing that will determine if 2 American pilots should be court-martialed. A U.S. military investigation determined the pilots disregarded rules of engagement and failed to exercise proper flight discipline. Families of the Canadian soldiers say they haven't come to Louisiana on a witch hunt, only to make sure this accident never happens again.
I want to hear ways of fixing this. I know there is a way of fixing this. I mean, you just don't bomb indiscriminately. It's not the way of fighting a war, hopefully.
70 Canadian soldiers were part of the unit firing live rounds in a training drill near Kandahar that night, but Major Harry Schmidt and Major Bill Umbach were convinced the unit was an al-Qaeda force firing at their F-16 fighter jets. They swooped in what they thought was self-defense and launched a 500-pound laser-guided bomb. Moments later, they were told to leave the area because friendlies were on the ground. It was already too late.
Had the pilots known Canadians were training below them, it would not have happened.
The pilot's attorneys say a communication breakdown led to the accident. They say Schmidt and Umbach were never told friendly forces were in that area. The attorneys also say this hearing will hurt American forces around the world.
Well, the repercussions are significant, and they've already been felt. In fact, the repercussions are that there are at least 1,000 fighter pilots watching what's going on here, and what they're being told is that if they make a mistake, they will not be backed up by their commanders. The first day of testimony has just wrapped up here at Barksdale Air Force Base in Bossier City, Louisiana. This hearing is expected to last about 2 weeks. Now, if it is recommended that these two pilots should face a court-martial trial, they could face up to 64 years in a military prison. Lou?
Ed, thank you. Ed Lavandera from Barksdale Air Force Base, Louisiana. My guest tonight says those pilots have been made scapegoats by the Pentagon for political reasons. Francis Boyle is international law professor at the University of Illinois and joins us tonight. Scapegoats, Professor, strong words. Why do you say that?
Well, thank you for having me on, Lou, to discuss this case of grave concern for the people of both Canada and the United States. I believe there were two fatal mistakes here that led to this terrible tragedy. First, someone in Canada mistakenly decided to set up a live fire exercise at night in an active war zone. That person should be dealt with. Second, as for the United States Command, the Canadian Armed Forces filed a proper report with the U.S. Command as to these exercises. For some reason, these pilots were never briefed that Canadian forces were going to be on maneuver that night. There was clearly a failure here in the chain of command. I believe the command itself is primarily responsible,
the U.S.
not
command.
These pilots. Yes, and as a matter of fact, one of the civilian defense attorneys here did subpoena the general in charge of this command, and the military judge in the Article 32 hearing, as I understand it, rejected that subpoena. I find that result to be unacceptable. The attorneys here and the defendants have a constitutional right to put that general on the stand under oath, subject him to cross-examination, and find out who was responsible for this failure of command. It seems that if there is any dereliction of duty here, it lies with the command and not with these pilots. I personally believe, I think we would all agree, that if these pilots had known that Canadian forces were on maneuver that night, they would have never dropped that bomb.
Obviously, they would certainly not have dropped that bomb had they known they were Canadian soldiers beneath them. You raise an interesting point in that you believe that someone should be dealt with in the Canadian command for setting up a nighttime live fire exercise, although the Canadians informed the U.S. command. Why do you believe that?
Well, I think there was some fault on the Canadian side. That is, whatever commander dreamed up a live fire exercise at night in a war zone, where it was well known that the United States Armed Forces had every type of combat aircraft in the air and on maneuvers and hitting targets. That person, I think, was at least negligent and should be dealt with by the Canadian command. But this is not to excuse the failure of command on the part of the Pentagon itself. As I understand it, the commander there was in Kuwait. Clearly, we want to see justice done here, both as Americans and as friends of the Canadians. But I personally believe that is not what we are seeing now. I have not had access to this 4,000-page report, which is still classified. But it seems to me that the Pentagon's position is, well, the system was fine. What the problem was here was the personnel. I don't see it that way at all. I think the system broke down. The personnel did the best they could under these very difficult circumstances. And if, as the Canadian citizen said at the beginning of your report, they want to fix the system and make sure it never happens again, we are not going to be able to do this putting these two airmen on trial.
Friendly fire, as you know, is the most tragic of wartime realities, but nonetheless a reality. Do you believe that this trial be proceeding had the 4 soldiers been American rather than Canadian, the 8 wounded been American rather than Canadian?
I think you're correct here, Lou, in your implication. Obviously, this was a national tragedy in Canada. We all know it. My mother's
and
maiden
America
name is Monarch, and in the United States as well. Part of my family is from Montreal. So these losses are greatly felt in Canada. But one has to consider the political implications involved here. The Bush administration clearly wants to keep Canada on board for the war in Afghanistan and the upcoming war in Iraq. And to do that, they have to make it appear as if they're going through the motions of a trial to hold someone accountable for this tragedy.
Professor Francis Boyle, we thank you for being here, and we will continue to watch this hearing, as I know you will. I hope you will come back and join us soon.
I'll be happy to come back at any time, Lou. Thank you.
Thank you. Coming up next year, the NFL won't allow certain commercials during this Super Bowl. Stay with us for that story and a great deal more.